The courtroom was made of crystal that sang when light touched it, and Commander Elena Vance stood at its center like a criminal waiting for death. She was alone in that vast space, her hands locked together by chains made of pure light that burned cold against her skin. And around her sat the judges of 12 alien species who had already decided her fate before she even spoke a single word. The Valthari delegation floated in chairs of woven energy, their bodies tall and thin like willows made of silver flesh, their eyes glowing with soft blue light that showed no warmth or mercy. The Crixan clicked their mandibles in a rhythm that sounded like laughter mixed with disgust. Their insectoid bodies covered in armor that had grown from their own bones over thousands of years of evolution. The Morath said nothing at all, because the Morath never spoke unless worlds were about to burn. And their silence was more frightening than any threat. Could ever be. Elena looked at them all, and felt her heart beating so hard that she thought it might crack. Her ribs from the inside. 6 months ago, she had been a simple survey commander, mapping dead systems at the edge of known space. And now she stood accused of crimes that carried a punishment worse than death itself. The High Arbiter rose from his throne of frozen starlight, and his name was Sorvan, a Valthari who had judged 10,000 cases, and had never once shown mercy to anyone who stood where Elena now stood. Commander Elena Vance of the Terran Federation, he said in a voice that echoed through the crystal chamber like thunder trapped in glass. You are charged with unauthorized entry into the sanctum of the progenitors, with desecration of holy ground that no living being has touched in 10,000 years, with sacrilege against the memory of those who created all life in this galaxy, and with crimes against the shared heritage of every species that has ever looked up at the stars and wondered where they came from. Elena wanted to speak, but the light chains tightened around her wrists whenever she tried to interrupt. The punishment for these crimes, Sorvan continued, is death by void casting, where your body will be thrown into the space between stars without protection, where you will have exactly 12 seconds to feel the cold of the universe before your blood boils and your lungs collapse and everything you ever were becomes nothing but frozen meat drifting forever in the dark. Murmur ran through the assembled species, and some of them seemed pleased by this announcement, while others simply watched with eyes that held no emotion at all. The Crixan ambassador leaned forward, his compound eyes reflecting Elena's face 1,000 times over, and he spoke in a voice like breaking shells. Let the humans speak before we vote, so that we may hear what excuse she offers for her barbarism. The light chains loosened just enough for Elena to breathe properly, and she looked around the courtroom at faces that were not human, at eyes that saw the universe in ways she could never understand, at minds that had been traveling between stars when her ancestors were still living in caves. My ship was called the Horizon's Edge, she said, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be, and we were mapping the outer reach when our hyperdrive failed in a way that should have killed us all instantly. She paused to gather her courage because the next part was the part that mattered most. We dropped out of hyperspace inside the defense grid of the sanctum, and the automated weapons hit us before we even knew where we were. And half my crew was dead in the first 30 seconds, while the other half was bleeding and screaming and begging me to save them. The Morath shifted in their seats, which was unusual because the Morath rarely moved for anything less than the death of sons. I saw the sanctum through the breach in our hull, Elena continued, and I knew what it was because every species knows what the progenitor temples look like, and I knew that entering was forbidden, and I knew that the punishment was death. She lifted her chin and looked directly at Sorvan with eyes that refused to look away. But my people were dying, and the temple had atmosphere. And I made the choice that any commander would make when their crew is bleeding out in front of them. You made the choice of a barbarian, the Crixan ambassador interrupted. The choice of a species that has only been among the stars for 300 years and still thinks that its own survival matters more than laws that have protected sacred ground for 10 millennia. Elena felt anger rising in her chest, like fire, looking for something to burn. "I saved 11 lives that day," she said. 11 people who had families waiting for them. 11 people who had done nothing wrong except serve on a ship that had a malfunction at the worst possible moment. And in doing so, Sorvan said coldly, "You walked through halls that were built by beings who created your species and mine. You breathed air that had not been disturbed since before your world had oceans. You touched controls that were meant to sleep forever until the end of time. I touched nothing," Elena said firmly. "I took nothing. I damaged nothing. I simply found a room with atmosphere and kept my people alive until rescue ships arrived 4 days later." The Velthari High Arbiter shook his head slowly, and the light in his eyes dimmed with something that might have been disappointment. "You still do not understand, do you, human?" Elena said nothing because she was tired of explaining herself to people who had already decided she was guilty. "The sanctum is not merely a temple," Sovan continued. "It is a test, a threshold, a door that remains closed until a species proves worthy of opening it. And in 10,000 years, no species has ever been deemed worthy. Not the Velthari, who mastered the manipulation of light itself. Not the Morath, who have lived since the first stars were born. Not even the Crixon, whose hive minds span entire systems." He pointed at Elena with a finger that glowed like a dying ember. "And now a human. A member of a species so young that the universe has barely noticed its existence. Has stumbled through that door like a child wandering into a sacred ceremony. And you ask us to forgive this because your friends were hurt?" Elena felt something cold settling in her stomach because she was beginning to understand that this trial had never been about justice. "This is not about what I did," she said quietly. "This is about what humanity is," Sorvan smiled. And it was not a kind smile at all. "Perhaps you're wiser than you appear. Commander Vance, the vote was called then, and each species cast their judgment one by one." And Elena watched as the word guilty appeared 12 times in lights that hung in the air like accusations made solid. She was guilty, and she was going to die. And there was nothing she could do about it except stand tall and refuse to let them see her cry. But as the guards of light came to take her away, Sorvan raised his hand to stop them. "There is one more tradition that must be observed before sentencing," he said. "One more ritual that dates back to the time of the progenitors themselves." Elena looked at him with eyes full of questions she was too proud to ask. "You will be taken to the Chamber of Echoes," Sorvan explained, "where you will stand before the last functioning relic of those who made us all. And you will be judged one final time by something far older and far wiser than any of us." The Crixon ambassador made a sound like clicking laughter. "A waste of time," he said. "The relic has rejected every species for 10,000 years. It will certainly reject a primitive human." Sorvan nodded slowly, and his glowing eyes held something that Elena could not read. "Perhaps," he said, "but tradition must be honored, even for humans." Elena felt the guards lifting her by the arms, and as they carried her toward a door that appeared in the crystal wall like a wound opening in flesh, she wondered what could possibly be waiting for her in a chamber named after the sounds that dead things make. The Chamber of Echoes was darkness given form, a space so vast that Elena could not see its walls or ceiling or floor, only endless black that swallowed light the way hunger swallows food. The guards of light released her at the threshold and retreated like they were afraid to enter. And Elena stood alone at the edge of nothing while her eyes tried to find something to focus on and failed completely. "Walk forward," came Sorvan's voice from somewhere behind her, carried by speakers hidden in the darkness. "Walk until you reach the center." Elena took a step and felt solid ground beneath her feet, even though she could see nothing. And she took another step and another until she lost count of how many times her boots had touched invisible stone. The darkness pressed against her like water pressing against a diver who has gone too deep. And she felt small in a way that she had never felt before. Not when she first saw the stars from orbit. Not when she commanded her own ship across the void between systems. Not even when she realized she was going to die for crimes she did not believe she had committed. Then she saw it. At first it was just a deeper shadow in the shadows. A place where the darkness was somehow thicker and more real. But as she walked closer, it began to take shape, like a dream becoming solid. The relic was a sphere of obsidian, the size of a small house, floating without support in the center of the chamber. And its surface was covered in writing that moved like living things crawling across stone. Elena stopped walking because her legs refused to carry her any closer. And she stared at the sphere with eyes that could not look away, even though looking at it made her head hurt in ways she could not explain. The writing was in no language she had ever seen. Symbols that twisted and changed and reformed themselves into new patterns every time she thought she understood what she was looking at. And the sphere itself seemed to pulse with something that was not quite light, and not quite darkness, but something in between that had no name in any human tongue. You stand before the oracle of the progenitors, Sylvan's voice announced from the speakers. The last functioning piece of technology created by those who seeded life throughout this galaxy. The device that has judged every spacefaring species for 10,000 years and found them all unworthy of the inheritance that awaits whoever passes its test. Elena heard pride in his voice, and something else that might have been hope. And she understood then that the Velthari had brought every one of their greatest leaders before this sphere and had watched every one of them be rejected. What am I supposed to do? She asked, and her voice sounded thin and weak in the vast darkness. Nothing, Sylvan replied. Simply stand there and let it see you. Let it judge you as it has judged all others, and when it rejects you, as it surely will, you will be taken to your execution with the knowledge that even the progenitors themselves found you lacking. Elena almost laughed at that because she was already going to die. So what did another rejection matter? But something about the sphere was pulling at her attention in ways she did not understand. And she found herself walking closer, even though every survival instinct in her body was screaming at her to run. The writing on the surface began to move faster, swirling like storms seen from orbit. And Elena felt pressure behind her eyes, like something was trying to look into her mind. Through windows that were not meant to be open, she thought about her crew, about the 11 people she had saved by breaking laws older than human civilization, about the way Marcus had bled in her arms while she carried him through corridors filled with smoke and fire, about the tears in young Ensign Park's eyes when she realized they were going to live after all. She thought about her mother back on Earth, who still sent video messages even though they took months to arrive, and her father, who had died 3 years ago from a disease that should have been curable if only the medicine had arrived in time, and the promise she had made at his grave to always protect the people who depended on her. She thought about humanity itself, all the billions of people scattered across 100 colonies, who had no idea that one of their own was standing before something ancient beyond comprehension, being judged for crimes committed in the name of love. The sphere pulsed, and the writing froze. Elena felt something vast and incomprehensible turning its attention toward her like a sun, noticing a single grain of sand. And in that moment she understood that this thing was not a machine at all, but something more. Something that had been waiting in the darkness for longer than her species had existed. I don't know what you want from me, she said quietly. I don't know what test I'm supposed to pass or what words I'm supposed to say. The sphere remained silent, watching, waiting. All I know is that my people were dying, and I couldn't let that happen, Elena continued. I couldn't stand there and watch them bleed out while a temple full of empty rooms sat just beyond reach. And if that makes me a criminal, then I'll die a criminal. But I won't apologize for saving lives. She lifted her chin the same way she had in the courtroom, refusing to look away, even though the sphere's attention felt like it was going to crush her into dust. I'd do it again, she said firmly. I'd break 1,000 laws and desecrate 1,000 temples if it meant saving even one person who depended on me. The sphere pulsed again, harder this time, and the writing on its surface began to glow with light that had no color. Light that somehow made the darkness darker. Instead of pushing it away, Elena felt something inside her responding to that light. Some part of her that she had never known existed vibrating like a string on an instrument being played by invisible hands, and then the oracle spoke. The voice was not sound exactly. It was meaning transmitted directly into her mind. Words that she understood, even though she was not hearing them with her ears. A message from something that had been waiting since before the stars were born. Protect. The single word hit Elena like a physical blow, and she staggered backward as images flooded her consciousness. Visions of beings made of light and thought. Visions of worlds being seeded with life. Visions of a great war against something horrible beyond description. Visions of the end of everything and the beginning of something new. Protect, the oracle repeated. And this time, the word echoed through the chamber like thunder that would not stop. And Elena heard screaming coming from the speakers, where Sorvan and the other observers had been watching in silence. She turned to look back toward where she had entered, and she saw light spilling through the doorway. The terrified faces of the guards who had retreated rather than enter the chamber. The chaos of beings who had expected nothing and received something they could not comprehend. What's happening? She shouted, but no one answered because no one could hear anything over the voice that was still speaking. Still repeating that single word that meant everything and nothing at the same time. The sphere rose higher into the air, and the writing on its surface began to project outward like a hologram expanding to fill the entire chamber. And Elena saw her own life reflected in those symbols. Every choice she had ever made, every sacrifice, every moment when she had put others before herself. She saw herself as a child, giving her lunch to a homeless man, even though she was hungry too. She saw herself as a teenager, running into a burning building to save a stranger's dog. She saw herself as a young officer taking a bullet meant for her captain. During a pirate raid on a colony transport, she saw the core of who she was, the thing that made her human in the way that mattered most. And she understood suddenly that this was what the oracle had been looking for, all in her intelligence. Because there were species far smarter than humans who had been rejected, not power. Because there were species who commanded forces that could shatter. Moons who had been turned away, not wisdom or age or technological achievement or any of the things that the galaxy valued most. The oracle had been looking for something simpler and rarer. The willingness to sacrifice everything for others. The strange and irrational love that made some beings run toward danger instead of away from it. The spark of something that the progenitors themselves had placed at the center of their greatest creation. The inheritor has arrived, the oracle announced, and its voice shook the chamber and the courtroom beyond and the station around them, and perhaps the entire sector of space where this ancient temple had waited for so long. Elena fell to her knees as the weight of those words pressed down on her, and she whispered the only question that mattered. What do you want me to do? The oracle's answer was gentle this time, almost kind. Like a parent speaking to a child who had finally come home after being lost for a very long time. Protect, it said one final time. As you have always done, as your kind has always done. As the progenitors always knew you would. And in the darkness of the Chamber of Echoes, Elena Vance began to understand that her trial had not been an ending at all, but the beginning of something that would change the galaxy forever. The visions hit every mind in the courtroom, like a wave crashing against a shore that had never seen water before. And for 17 minutes, no one moved or spoke or even breathed as the oracle showed them things that no living species had ever been permitted to see. The Velthari collapsed in their floating chairs, their glowing eyes flickering like candles in a storm, their perfect composure shattered by images that rewrote everything they believed about themselves and their place in the universe. The Crixons screeched in their clicking language, their hive minds overloading as billions of connected individuals across a dozen worlds all experienced the same revelation at exactly the same moment. And 3 of their ambassadors simply stopped functioning, their bodies going rigid as their consciousness retreated somewhere deep and dark and safe. The Morath wept, which was something that no other species had ever seen them do in all the millions of years they had existed. Tears of silver fluid rolling down faces carved from what looked living stone. And the sound of their crying was like mountains learning how to grieve. Elena stood in the center of it all, the oracle floating beside her now like a moon that had chosen its planet. And she watched the most powerful beings in the galaxy break apart under the weight of truths they had never wanted to know. The vision showed the progenitors as they had truly been. Vast intelligences made of energy and thought who had existed before matter itself had cooled enough to form stars. Beings who had watched the universe take shape and had decided to fill it with life because loneliness was something even gods could not endure. They had seeded a billion worlds with the building blocks of existence, had watched species rise and fall and rise again over epochs that made geological ages seem like heartbeats, had loved their creations with a love that transcended anything that flesh could feel or words could describe. And then the vision showed the enemy. It came from somewhere else, from a place between dimensions where the normal rules of existence did not apply. And it was hungry in ways that had no comparison in any language ever spoken. The progenitors called it the Hollow. And it ate meaning itself, consumed the very concept of existence wherever it touched, left behind nothing but emptiness so profound that even the vacuum of space seemed full by comparison. The war had lasted for longer than the current universe had existed, fought across realities and timelines and possibilities. And in the end, the progenitors had known that they could not win, but they could prepare. They could leave behind weapons and shields and warnings, scattered across the galaxy like seeds waiting for the right soil, dormant until a species arose that could use them, a species that carried within itself the one quality that the Hollow could not understand or devour. They knew, Elena said softly as the visions finally faded and the courtroom returned to silence. They knew we were coming. Sorvan rose from where he had fallen, his elegant robes torn and stained with fluids that Velthari bodies produced only under extreme stress. And his eyes held something that Elena had never expected to see in them. Fear. "This cannot be," he said, his voice trembling in ways that made him sound like a child rather than the highest authority in galactic law. The Velthari have served as guardians of the progenitor legacy for 10,000 years. We have kept their temple safe and their relics protected and their memory alive. You were caretakers, the oracle said, its voice filling the chamber once more. Faithful servants who preserved what you could not understand, and you served well. But you were never the inheritors. The Crixon ambassador, who could still function, rose on shaking legs, his compound eyes reflecting Elena's face in fractured pieces. "Why?" he demanded. "Why humans? They are children among the stars, primitives who were still burning fossil fuels when we had already mapped half the galaxy. What could they possibly have that we lack?" The oracle pulsed and new visions appeared, smaller this time, contained within a sphere of light that everyone could see, but that did not overwhelm them the way the first visions had. Elena watched scenes from human history play out like a documentary. made by beings who saw time as just another dimension to explore. A soldier in ancient armor, throwing himself on an enemy spear to protect his wounded friend. A woman running into a collapsing building to save children she had never met. A doctor staying in a plague city when everyone else had fled because someone needed to help the dying. She saw firefighters climbing stairs into burning towers that everyone knew would fall. Saw ordinary people forming human chains to rescue strangers from floods. Saw the countless small moments when humans had chosen others over themselves for no reason except that it felt like the right thing to do. The progenitors searched for this, the oracle explained. Across 10 trillion worlds and 1 billion years, they searched for species that would sacrifice without calculation, that would protect without expecting reward, that would love strangers enough to die for them. The vision showed other species being tested. The Valthari, who had built magnificent civilizations, but always placed survival above sacrifice. The Krixan, whose hive minds protected their own, but could not extend that protection to outsiders. The Morath, who had outlived stars but had done so by choosing isolation over intervention. Every species we tested had greatness, the oracle continued. Intelligence and creativity and wisdom beyond measure. But when we looked into their cores, we found the same thing, a fundamental orientation toward self-preservation that would always, eventually, choose survival over sacrifice. Elena felt the weight of what the oracle was saying settling onto her shoulders like a cloak made of responsibility and fear. And humans? She asked. Humans are broken, the oracle said. And there was something in its voice that might have been wonder. Beautifully. Impossibly broken in exactly the way we needed. New visions appeared. A man jumping into icy water to save a drowning stranger. A teenager stepping between a bully and a smaller child. A nurse holding the hand of a dying patient who had no family left to mourn them. Your species evolved wrong, the oracle explained. Or perhaps right, depending on perspective. Somewhere in your development, you acquired a flaw that makes no evolutionary sense. A tendency to value other lives as much as or more than your own. A compulsion to protect that overrides the basic survival instinct that every other species holds sacred. Sorvan was shaking his head, unwilling or unable to accept what he was hearing. This is insanity, he said. Humans wage war. They commit atrocities. They destroy their own planet with pollution and greed. How can they be the species the progenitors chose? Because even your worst humans struggle against their own darkness, the oracle replied. Because even in your most terrible moments, there are always some of you running toward the fire instead of away from it. Because your capacity for evil is matched and exceeded by your capacity for irrational, self-destructive good. Elena thought about history, about all the terrible things humans had done to each other over the millennia. And she felt shame mixing with something that might have been pride. We're not heroes, she said quietly. We're just people, flawed and broken and constantly failing to live up to our own ideals. That is why you were chosen, the oracle said. Heroes do not doubt themselves. Heroes do not feel the weight of their failures. Heroes are stories, but you are real, and real beings who keep trying despite their failures. Who keep protecting despite their fears, who keep sacrificing despite knowing they will often fail. The visions faded completely, and the courtroom sat in silence that felt like the universe holding its breath. The hollow is waking, the oracle announced, and its voice carried a warning that made even the ancient Morath shudder. It has slept since the progenitors fell, but it is beginning to stir, and when it rises fully, it will consume everything that exists unless the inheritors are ready to stand against it. Elena looked at the oracle, at the alien judges who had condemned her to death just hours ago, at the weight of expectation that was settling onto a species that had barely learned to travel between stars. How long do we have? She asked. Centuries, perhaps, the oracle replied. Perhaps less. The hollow does not experience time the way you do. And its waking is not a single moment, but a process that has already begun. Sorvin stepped forward, his fear transforming into something harder and more dangerous. Then we must prepare, he said. All of us, together. If this threat is real, then petty politics and old grudges must be set aside. But Elena saw the calculation in his eyes, the way his mind was already working through the implications of what they had learned. And she understood that the revelation of human inheritance would not bring unity, it would bring war. The relics, the Crixan ambassador said slowly, his mandibles clicking with renewed energy. The weapons caches, the defensive systems, they will all respond to humans now, won't they? The oracle did not answer, which was answer enough. Then humanity has just become the most powerful species in the galaxy. The ambassador continued. Whether they deserve it or not, whether they can be trusted with that power or not. Elena watched the fear in the room transform into something worse. Jealousy and ambition, and the cold calculation of beings who had survived for millennia by being willing to do whatever was necessary to protect their own interests. 3 months had passed since the Chamber of Echoes, and the galaxy was tearing itself apart. Elena stood on the observation deck of the Terran flagship Defiant, watching the newsfeed scroll across holographic screens that showed riots on a dozen worlds, diplomatic missions collapsing into shouting matches, and warships gathering at borders that had been peaceful for centuries. The oracle floated beside her as it always did now, following her like a shadow that cast light instead of darkness. And she hated it almost as much as she needed it. You could stop this, it said in her mind, its voice gentle but insistent. The progenitor weapons would bring peace within hours. Peace through fear isn't peace, Elena replied. It's just slavery with better marketing. The feed showed a Velthari protest on their homeworld. Thousands of silver-skinned beings marching through crystal streets carrying signs that called for humanity's destruction. Their perfect faces twisted with rage that their species had been deemed unworthy of an inheritance they had protected for 10 millennia. Another screen showed Crixan hive ships massing near the human colony of New Melbourne, officially there for defensive exercises, but positioned in a way that made military analysts very nervous. The Morath had not spoken at all since the revelation, which was perhaps the most frightening response of all, because no one knew what the ancient beings were planning in their hidden worlds at the galaxy's edge. They're going to attack, Elena said. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. They've already decided that humans can't be trusted with progenitor technology. They are afraid, the oracle replied. Fear makes all species dangerous, even the wisest ones. Admiral Chun entered the observation deck, her uniform crisp despite the obvious exhaustion in her eyes. And she saluted Elena with a respect that still felt strange coming from someone who had commanded fleets when Elena was still learning to walk. Commander Vance, Chen said formally. The Security Council has finished their deliberations, and they want you to activate the defense grid around Earth and the core colonies. Use the progenitor shields to protect our most important worlds. Elena turned away from the screens to face the Admiral directly. That would mean abandoning the outer colonies, she said. 3 billion people living in systems too far from Earth to be protected by the grid. Yes, Chun admitted, her voice heavy with the weight of that number. But it would guarantee the survival of 12 billion others. The oracle pulsed softly, and Elena felt it offering her the codes, the knowledge, the power to do exactly what the council wanted, to wrap humanity's heartland in shields that no fleet could penetrate and let the outer worlds fend for themselves. She thought about the colonists on New Melbourne, about the miners on Proxima Station, about the research teams on distant moons who had gone to the edges of human space, because they believed in exploration and discovery and the dream of reaching further into the unknown. No, she said. Admiral Chun blinked in surprise. Commander, the Council? The Council can make recommendations, but the Oracle responds to me. And I won't use progenitor technology to choose which humans are worth saving and which ones are expendable. Chun's face shifted through several emotions before settling on something that looked almost like respect. Then what do you propose we do? The alien fleets are gathering. Our own military is spread too thin to defend everywhere at once. And every day that passes brings us closer to a war we cannot win through conventional means. Elena turned back to the screens, watching the chaos unfold across 100 worlds. And she felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her like gravity had suddenly tripled. The Oracle had shown her things over the past 3 months. Secrets that it said only the inheritors could know. The locations of weapons caches that could destroy entire star systems. The sleeping armadas of automated warships waiting in hidden hangars. The great shields that could protect whole sectors of space from any attack. It had also shown her the hollow she saw it in her dreams now. A darkness that was not merely absence of light, but absence of everything. A hunger so vast that it made the void between galaxies seem small and cozy by comparison. The alien species arguing over progenitor inheritance did not understand what was coming. Could not understand because their minds had not been opened the way Elena's had been. And their petty conflicts and jealous fears seemed almost childish in the face of the true enemy. But she could not tell them that. Could not share the visions because the Oracle said they were not ready. Said that knowledge of the hollow had driven entire civilizations mad with despair before the awakening of the inheritors. I need to speak with Sorvan, Elena said finally, face to face. Without diplomats or translators or political handlers. Chun frowned. The Velthari High Arbiter has not responded to any communication attempts since the revelation. He's locked himself in some kind of meditation chamber and refuses to see anyone. Then I'll go to him. That's incredibly dangerous. Commander, the Velthari homeworld is not exactly friendly territory right now. Elena smiled. And it was not a happy smile. The Oracle can get me there safely. And I think Sorvan needs to hear some things that I can't say through official channels. Chun studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You're not really asking for permission, are you? I'm the inheritor of the progenitors, Elena said. Which apparently means I get to make decisions that affect the entire galaxy without asking anyone's permission. And I hate every second of it. The Oracle transported her to the Velthari homeworld in a flash of light that bent space in ways that made her stomach flip and her brain hurt. And she arrived in a garden of crystal flowers that sang in the wind from a sun that burned blue-white in a sky. The color of twilight. Sorvan was waiting for her, which meant he had known she was coming before she even decided to make the trip. Commander Vance, he said, his voice tired in ways that went beyond physical exhaustion. You should not have come here. You haven't been answering calls. I have been thinking, Sorvan replied. For the first time in 3,000 years, I have had to actually think about what I believe and why I believe it. He gestured for her to follow him through the garden, past crystal trees that held memories of Velthari who had died long ago, past fountains that flowed with liquid light, past statues of beings that Sorvan said were Velthari heroes from eras before humans existed. I have served the progenitor legacy my entire life, he said as they walked. I believed that service would eventually be rewarded, that we would prove ourselves worthy of their inheritance through patience and devotion and careful stewardship. And then a human crashed into a sacred temple and got chosen in 5 minutes. Elena said Sorvan made a sound that might have been a laugh if the Velthari laughed the way humans did. You understand our frustration. Then, I understand it perfectly, Elena replied. Because I feel the same way. I'm not a leader or a prophet or a chosen one. I'm a survey ship commander who made a desperate choice to save her crew and somehow ended up responsible for the fate of the galaxy. They stopped at the edge of a cliff that overlooked a valley filled with crystal towers that caught the blue light and scattered it into rainbows. The other species are planning war, Sylvain said. The Crixon have already begun mobilizing their high fleets. The Morath are silent, which usually means they are preparing something terrible. I know. You could stop them. Sylvain continued. The progenitor weapons could end any threat before it begins. I could, Elena agreed. And then what? I become the tyrant who rules through fear. Humanity becomes the oppressor that keeps the galaxy in line through superior firepower. And everything the progenitors hoped we would be gets corrupted into everything they were trying to prevent. Sorvan turned to look at her with eyes that glowed less brightly than they had before. Dimmed by something that might have been shame. You are wiser than I gave you credit for. Commander, I'm not wise, Elena said. I'm just trying to figure out how to protect everyone without becoming the monster that makes protection necessary. She looked out over the valley, at the beauty that the Velthari had built over millennia of patient work. And she made a decision that felt right even though it terrified her. I want you to help me, she said. Not as the High Arbiter of the Galactic Conclave, not as a Velthari defending your species' interests, but as someone who cared enough about the progenitor legacy to spend 10,000 years protecting it. Sorvam was silent for a long moment. Help you do what? Build something better, Elena replied. A coalition that isn't based on fear or dominance or inherited power. Something that proves the progenitors were right to choose us by showing that we won't make the same mistakes every other dominant species has made throughout history. And if the other species refuse? If they attack before your coalition can form? Elena felt the oracle pulse beside her, offering power and certainty and the easy path of violence that had solved problems for every species since the first predator ate the first prey. Then we protect them anyway, she said. We take their hits and refuse to strike back. We show them that humans are exactly what the progenitors believe we were. Even if it kills us. Sylvain stared at her for a very long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice held something that Elena had never expected to hear from a Velthari. Hope. The ultimatum arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a Crixon diplomatic vessel that did not bother to request permission before entering Earth's orbital. Read the demands in a conference room filled with the highest-ranking officials of the Terran Federation. Their faces pale with fear as the words scrolled across the screen. Surrender all progenitor knowledge and technology within 72 hours. Submit to permanent oversight by a coalition of elder species. Accept restrictions on human expansion and development that would essentially reduce humanity to a client race with no real independence. If we refuse, Admiral Chun said quietly, they will attack. 12 fleets, General Morrison added, his military mind already calculating the impossible odds. Lothari Lightweavers, Crixon hive ships, Morath dreadnoughts that have destroyed civilizations older than human history. And that's just what they're showing us openly. Elena looked at the oracle floating beside her chair, felt its presence in her mind, offering solutions that ended in fire and blood and the submission of every species that had dared to threaten humanity's inheritance. She thought about everything she had learned in the 6 months since the Chamber of Echoes, the wars the progenitors had fought, the civilizations they had watched rise and fall, the endless cycle of species clawing their way to dominance only to be replaced by something newer and hungrier and more willing to do terrible things in the name of survival. What are our options? President Singh asked, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. General Morrison activated a holographic display that showed human space surrounded by hostile forces. We could activate the progenitor weapons, he said. Strike first, before they have a chance to coordinate their attack. The Oracle has shown Commander Advance the locations of enough firepower to destroy every hostile fleet in a matter of hours. And then we become exactly what they're afraid of. Elena said. The tyrant species that rules through fear. The monster that proves every prejudice they've ever held about young civilizations being too dangerous to trust with power. At least we'd be alive, Morrison countered. Elena stood and walked to the window that overlooked Earth. The blue-green marble that had given birth to her species. The cradle of humanity that had somehow produced beings crazy enough to reach for the stars. When I was 12 years old, she said quietly, my school bus crashed into a river during a flood, and I watched a man I'd never met jump into the water to save us. He pulled 7 kids out before the current took him under, and we never even learned his name. The room was silent. Uncertain where she was going with this story, my father used to say that humans are at their best when things are at their worst. Elena continued. That something in us wakes up when other people are in danger. Something that doesn't care about odds or consequences or our own survival. She turned back to face the assembled leaders. The progenitors chose us because of that something. Not because we're strong or smart or technologically advanced, but because we have this insane, beautiful tendency to run toward fire instead of away from it. Commander, Admiral Chen said carefully, I appreciate the sentiment, but sentiment won't stop 12 fleets from turning Earth into rubble. No, Elena agreed. But maybe something else will. She felt the oracle pulse with confusion, which was odd because she hadn't known it could feel confused. I want to address all 12 fleets directly, she said. Open communication broadcast to every ship. Let them hear what I have to say before they decide whether to attack. President Singh frowned. What exactly do you plan to say? Elena smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had finally figured out the answer to a question that had been haunting her for months. I'm going to tell them the truth. 6 hours later, Elena stood on the bridge of the Defiant as it moved into position at the edge of human space, facing an armada that stretched across her view screen like a wall of metal and death. The Oracle floated beside her, and she could feel its uncertainty mixing with something that might have been hope. All channels open. Communications Officer Park reported. They're receiving. Elena took a deep breath and began to speak. My name is Elena Vance, and 6 months ago, I was condemned to death for saving my crew's lives by entering a sacred temple. Most of you know what happened next. The Oracle spoke. It chose humanity as inheritors of the progenitor legacy. And suddenly, everything changed. She paused, looking at the ships arrayed against her. I understand why you're here. You're afraid. You've seen what happens when young species get too much power too quickly. You've watched civilizations burn because someone decided that might made right. And you don't want that to happen again. The Oracle pulsed, offering her the codes to defensive systems that could make the Defiant invulnerable. But she ignored it. The progenitors left behind weapons that could destroy your fleets in seconds. Shields that could make every human world untouchable. Technology so advanced that you would never be able to threaten us again. She heard gasps from her bridge crew. Saw General Morrison's face go, pale with anger at what he thought was a tactical mistake. I'm not going to use any of it. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across light years. I'm going to order every human ship to power down their weapons. Elena continued. I'm going to lower our shields. I'm going to make us completely vulnerable to whatever you decide to do next. Admiral Chung grabbed her arm, voice harsh with shock. Commander, you can't. I can, Elena said firmly. And I will, because this is what it means to be human. She turned back to the screen. The progenitors didn't choose us because we're warriors. They chose us because we're protectors, because something in our species makes us willing to die for others, even when it makes no logical sense. Even when it would be so much easier to just fight back. The alien fleets held their positions. Weapons still powered, but no one was firing. "You can destroy us," Elena said. "You can wipe out humanity and take the progenitor technology for yourselves, and tell the history books that you did what was necessary to protect the galaxy from a dangerous young species." She felt tears forming in her eyes, but refused to let them fall. "But I don't think you will, because I think somewhere deep inside every species that ever looked up at the stars and wondered, there's the same thing that the progenitors saw in us. The same capacity for something better than survival. The same ability to choose protection over destruction." The Oracle pulsed urgently, showing her data streaming in from across the galaxy. Other progenitor relics were waking. Ancient devices that had slept for 10,000 years were beginning to stir in response to something they were sensing in this moment. "We won't fire first," Elena said. "We won't rule through fear. We won't become the monsters you're afraid of. Even if that means we die here today," she gave the order. And across the human fleet, weapons powered down and shields flickered off, leaving them defenseless against forces that could annihilate them in moments. "That's our choice," Elena finished. "Now you have to make yours." The silence lasted for 7 minutes that felt like 7 years. Then, one by one, the progenitor relics scattered across the galaxy began to sing. Elena felt it through the Oracle. Ancient devices on dead moons and forgotten temples and hidden vaults, all responding to the same signal. All recognizing the same thing that the Oracle had recognized in her 6 months ago. They rose from their resting places in columns of light that could be seen across entire systems. And they spoke in a chorus that echoed through every communication frequency the galaxy had ever used. "The test is complete." The alien fleet stopped dead. Every ship frozen as their crews experienced visions similar to what Elena had seen in the Chamber of Echoes. "The inheritors have proven worthy." The progenitor relics began to move. Not toward Earth, not toward any single world, but spreading out across the galaxy in a pattern that the Oracle helped Elena understand. They were forming a network, a web of protection that would cover every inhabited world, regardless of species. Let the Second Age begin. Shields flickered to life around planets that had never known such protection. Around Velthari homeworlds and Crixon colonies and Mora sanctuaries. Around human space and alien space alike. Around every world where life had taken root and struggled toward the stars. The progenitors had not left weapons for humans to wield. Against their enemies, they had left protection for everyone, waiting for a species wise enough to refuse power and brave enough to trust in something better. Elena watched through tear-blurred eyes as the alien fleets powered down their weapons. As communication channels filled with voices asking questions and offering apologies and expressing wonder at what they were, witnessing Sarvan's face appeared on her screen. And for the first time since she had met him, the Velthari High Arbiter looked at her with something that might have been friendship. "You magnificent fool," he said. "You beautiful, impossible fool," Elena laughed. And it was the laugh of someone who had bet everything on hope and won. "That's humanity," she said. "We protect people, even the ones pointing guns at us." The galaxy had changed in a single moment. Not through war or conquest or the demonstration of superior force, but through an act of trust that should have been insane but somehow wasn't.